I was 29 when it happened, in late October of 2017. I had driven out to a remote area of northern Montana for a solo camping trip. I'd been camping alone before, but never this deep in the backcountry. I had a week off work, and I wanted to get away from everything. No phone signal, no traffic, no people. The weather had been dry for the last week, and the forecast said it would be cold but clear. I packed my tent, sleeping bag, small camp stove, a hatchet, a hunting knife, and enough food for 3 days. The dirt road leading to the area I chose was barely a road at all, just a pair of ruts running through the trees. I parked my old Toyota pickup in a small clearing about 3 miles from the nearest main road and hiked in another 2 miles until I found a flat spot near a shallow creek. The place was quiet, except for the sound of water trickling over rocks. Tall pines surrounded the clearing on 3 sides, with the creek cutting along the 4th. I set up my tent, gathered some dry wood, and got a small fire going before sunset. The air dropped in temperature quickly. By the time the last light faded from the sky, my breath was visible. The stars looked sharp and clear, the kind of night sky you never see near towns. I ate a quick dinner, just some beans and bread, then sat near the fire until I felt tired enough to crawl into my sleeping bag. The first night passed without trouble. I woke up at dawn to frost on my tent and my water bottle partially frozen. I spent the morning walking upstream, just exploring. The forest here was dense, the kind where you lose sight of the sky in places. There were deer tracks near the water and, farther from the creek, a set of much larger prints, probably elk. I didn't think much of it at the time. By late afternoon, I was back at camp. I built my fire higher to fight the evening cold. Around 7 p.m., I noticed how quickly the forest seemed to go dark compared to the open spots. It was like the trees swallowed the last bits of light. I kept busy splitting some thicker logs so I wouldn't have to gather more later. Sometime after dark, while I was sitting near the fire, I heard a single sharp crack in the trees behind me, like a branch snapping under weight. I froze for a moment and listened. Nothing followed, so I assumed it was just an animal passing through. Out here, that was normal. But 20 minutes later, there was another sound. This time, it was heavier. A slow crunch of leaves, then silence. The sound had come from farther down the tree line, almost parallel to the creek. I aimed my flashlight in that direction, but the beam only cut through a few yards of undergrowth. Nothing moved. I told myself it was just a deer or maybe an elk, and went back to tending the fire. When I finally turned in for the night, I made sure to zip the tent all the way. I kept my hatchet close inside, more out of habit than fear. It took me a while to fall asleep because I could hear faint noises outside. Occasional light steps, like something moving slowly through the leaves. Every time I thought I heard them, I held my breath, but the sound would stop. Eventually, I drifted off. I woke in the middle of the night with a start. My fire had burned down to embers, and the cold had settled deep into the air. I couldn't hear anything at first, just the faint gurgle of the creek. Then, very faintly, I heard the sound again, crunch, pause, crunch. Slow, deliberate steps coming from the direction of the creek this time. They stopped after maybe 6 or 7 steps. I lay there, staring into the dark above me, waiting. My heartbeat was so loud in my ears it drowned out everything else. After a long stretch of silence, I told myself it could have been ice cracking on the water or maybe a raccoon. I stayed still until my eyes grew heavy again. The second day went mostly normal. I hiked farther out, bringing my day pack and some food. By afternoon, clouds began rolling in from the west, and the air took on that heavy stillness before weather changes. I hurried back to camp before it got too late. That night, the fire was harder to keep going. The wood felt slightly damp from the air. I ate, cleaned my pan, and sat there for a while, listening to the occasional rustle of wind in the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just paranoia. It felt like there was something just out of my sight line, staying still until I wasn't looking. Around 9 p.m., I heard it again, but closer this time. The same slow, heavy steps coming from the trees directly across the creek. They were spaced too far apart for a small animal. I aimed my flashlight but saw nothing, just trunks and branches. The light reflected off the water in a dull shimmer. I called out loudly, not words, just a sharp shout, hoping to scare off whatever it was. The forest went dead silent. Even the usual background noises, like distant insects or rustling leaves, seemed to fade. I kept the fire going longer that night, feeding it more wood than usual. I didn't want to be in the dark. When I finally did get into the tent, I lay awake for hours, staring at the roof. Every tiny sound outside seemed magnified. Somewhere deep in the night, I woke again. No sound at first, just that strange feeling in my gut. Then came the noise. Not steps this time, but a slow, dragging sound in the leaves, moving from the left side of my tent toward the back. I didn't move. My breathing felt loud, and I tried to control it. The sound stopped directly behind my tent. I gripped the hatchet handle, my hands slick with sweat, and just waited. After what felt like several minutes, there was a faint rustle and then nothing. I lay there until daylight. The next morning, I stepped outside to look. Behind my tent, the ground was disturbed. Leaves brushed aside, small patches of dirt visible, like something had stood there. No clear prints, just disruption. I'd had enough. I decided I'd leave after breakfast. While I packed up, the forest felt wrong. The wind had picked up slightly, and somewhere far off, I heard a tree creak and fall. I kept glancing at the tree line, but nothing moved. I loaded my backpack, doused the fire, and started the hike back to my truck. The trail felt longer than before. I kept hearing faint sounds behind me. A branch snapping, leaves crunching. But every time I turned around, the path was empty. My pace quickened without me realizing. I didn't stop for water, didn't stop at all until I saw the outline of my truck through the trees. When I got there, my stomach dropped. There were fresh footprints in the dirt near the driver's side, not mine. They were boot prints larger than my own, leading from the tree line to my truck, then back into the woods. My truck bed cover had been shifted slightly, like someone had tried to open it. I threw my bag inside, got in, and started the engine without looking around again. The dirt road felt like it took forever, but I didn't stop until I hit the main road. I never found out who or what had been out there with me those nights, but I know it wasn't an animal. The steps were too heavy, too deliberate, and those footprints by my truck, those told me I hadn't just been imagining things. I haven't camped alone since. It was late September of 2016 when I decided to head out on a solo camping trip deep in northern Arizona. I had been working too many long weeks in the city, and the noise, traffic, and constant movement were wearing me thin. I wanted silence, the kind you only find miles away from any road, where even planes rarely pass overhead. I planned for 3 nights, far enough from anything that I wouldn't see another person unless I went looking for them. I packed my old Ford Ranger the night before. Tent, sleeping bag, extra blankets, 2 jugs of water, a small propane stove, and just enough food to keep it light. I brought my hunting knife and a .22 rifle, not because I planned to hunt, but because I knew there were coyotes and the occasional black bear in those woods. I left Phoenix before dawn, driving north with the windows down. The highway was empty until I reached Flagstaff and turned onto a smaller road heading east. Soon, the pavement turned to gravel and then to a narrow dirt track. I followed it until my tires crunched over dry pine needles instead of rock. My GPS had lost signal miles back, and I liked it that way. I pulled over near a small clearing with a slope leading down into thick pine forest. There was a faint path that looked like it had been made by deer. Setting up camp took an hour. I pitched my tent in the clearing, tied a tarp between two trees for shade, and gathered some fallen branches for a fire pit. The air was cool, almost cold when the wind shifted, and the smell of pine sap was heavy in the air. I could hear nothing but the occasional creak of trees and the faint tapping of a woodpecker far off. The first day passed peacefully. I walked the surrounding area, marking landmarks so I wouldn't get turned around. The sun set early behind the hills, leaving the forest in a dim, bluish light. I cooked a small meal over the propane stove and sat by the fire until the wood burned low. By 9, the cold had chased me into the tent. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up without knowing why. I lay still, listening. The forest wasn't quiet anymore. Somewhere far off, I could hear a single sharp crack, like a branch breaking, but it was spaced out, almost rhythmic. It would happen once, then nothing for half a minute, then again. It didn't sound like footsteps. It didn't sound like wind. It went on for maybe 10 minutes, then stopped completely. The second day was warmer, and I spent most of it exploring a ridge to the north. The terrain was rough, loose soil, rocks underfoot, but the view was worth it. I could see rolling hills covered in endless pines, with a silver thread of a creek winding between them. On my way back, I spotted something odd about 100 yards from camp. A large section of bark stripped clean off a tree about 6 feet up. The exposed wood was pale and fresh. Bears sometimes do that, but the claw marks were strange. Too shallow for a bear, more like someone had scraped it with a blade. That night, I built a bigger fire, more for comfort than warmth. I kept thinking about that stripped tree. The sound from the night before lingered in my head, and I wondered if it was connected. As darkness fell, I noticed how different the forest felt. The air seemed heavier, muffled, like the trees were pressing in. I lay in my tent for hours, staring at the nylon ceiling. The fire had burned down to embers outside. At some point, I heard it again, the cracking sound, but this time it was closer, not far off and faint. It was maybe 50 yards away in the trees. Crack, wait, crack. The timing was the same, slow and deliberate. My stomach felt tight, and every hair on my arms was standing. Then I heard something else, a faint rustle of leaves, and the sound of dirt shifting under weight. Not running, not hurried, just slow, steady movement. I reached for the rifle, careful not to make the tent fabric shake. The sound moved around the edge of the clearing. I could hear it circling, staying just out of sight. Every so often, a stick would snap. I stayed frozen, hardly breathing, my finger resting near the trigger. After maybe 15 minutes, it stopped. The forest went dead silent again. I stayed awake until the sky began to lighten, my ears straining for anything else, but there was nothing. On the third day, I seriously considered packing up, but I told myself I was overreacting. Probably a deer, maybe even a stray cow from one of the ranches miles away. Still, I kept the rifle closer as I went about collecting water from the creek and cooking breakfast. Around noon, I decided to follow the deer path down into the woods. The ground was soft with deep layers of needles. The air was cooler there, and the light barely made it through the canopy. After maybe half a mile, I found something that made me stop dead. A small campfire ring, long cold, with a few charred sticks still inside. Around it were 3 large rocks that had clearly been placed as seats. There was no trash, no gear, nothing to show who had used it or when. But there were tracks, boot prints, maybe a size 11, leading away into the forest. I didn't follow them. Back at camp, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain. I cooked early and kept the fire going, feeling uneasy as the light dimmed. The clouds made it darker than the previous nights, and the shadows seemed deeper. Sometime after midnight, I woke again. This time, there was no cracking sound, no footsteps, just silence, thick, absolute silence. Then, without warning, something brushed against the side of my tent. A firm drag, like a hand or a stick running slowly from one end to the other. My chest tightened so much it hurt. I gripped the rifle and sat up, every muscle locked. The sound came again, this time from the other side. Slow, deliberate. My mind was racing. There was no wind. Whatever it was knew exactly where my tent was and was circling it. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, just enough to see out. The fire was nearly out, only glowing coals left. Beyond that, the clearing was just shadows. No shape, no movement. But the sound had stopped the moment I looked. I didn't sleep again. I sat with my back to my pack, rifle pointed at the door, waiting for dawn. When morning finally came, I packed up in under 30 minutes. My hands shook as I stuffed the tent away. I kept glancing into the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there. The dirt road back to the main highway had fresh tire tracks that hadn't been there when I arrived. They weren't mine, they were from a much larger vehicle, maybe a truck with heavy treads. They led in the same direction I was heading, but veered off into another faint path a mile down. I didn't follow. I didn't stop. When I reached pavement again, the relief was so strong it felt like my body had dropped 20 pounds. I don't know who or what was out there those nights, but it wasn't an animal. It moved with purpose. It watched, and it stayed just far enough away that I couldn't prove it was there. That was the last time I camped alone in those woods. It was late September 2016 when I decided to go on a solo camping trip in the Peak District. I was 29 at the time, and I'd been doing weekend camping trips for years. I liked the quiet. I liked being away from everyone. The summer crowds were gone by that time of year, so I knew I'd probably have most of the area to myself. I parked my small car in a lay-by just off a narrow country lane and hiked about a mile into the moors. The air was damp and cool, the grass wet enough to darken my boots after a few steps. The heather stretched for miles, a dull mix of purple and brown. There were no proper trails where I was headed, just faint sheep tracks that led up into the hills. I had my tent, sleeping bag, stove, and enough food for 2 nights. By late afternoon, I'd found a small, slightly sloped patch of grass near a cluster of rocks that blocked the wind. I pitched my tent facing the open moorland. The light was already dimming. Clouds rolled in low, smothering the last of the sun. I boiled water for tea and ate from a tin of stew while sitting on one of the rocks, listening to the wind hissing through the grass. The first strange thing happened just before dark. I was walking about 50 yards from camp, looking for a spot to relieve myself, when I noticed movement on the far ridge. At first, I thought it was just a sheep, but as I squinted, I could see a person standing there. They were too far away for me to make out much detail, but they were definitely facing my direction. It was odd, because there was nothing else out there. No houses, no trails, nothing but moorland and stone walls. I told myself it was probably another hiker, maybe just watching the sunset, and I went back to my tent. When I glanced back up, the ridge was empty. The wind grew stronger as night set in. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to it pull and snap at the tent fabric. Now and then, I thought I heard something heavier than the wind, short bursts of sound, like footsteps in the grass. But every time I unzipped the tent and looked, there was only darkness. My headlamp's beam disappeared into the mist after a few feet. I must have drifted off, because the next thing I remember was waking up sometime after midnight. The wind had died completely, which was unsettling after hours of constant noise. The silence was thick. I lay there, staring at the nylon above me, wondering what had woken me. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate crunch of boots on wet ground. The sound was close, I froze, every muscle tensed. The steps came from the direction of the rocks I'd been sitting on earlier. They stopped for a long moment. Then came another sound, the faint rasp of fabric, like someone shifting in place. I slid my hand into my backpack, feeling for the small camping knife I kept inside. The tent's thin walls felt like nothing, just a sheet between me and whoever was out there. I thought about unzipping the flap and yelling, but the idea of making any sound felt wrong, like it would invite something in. The noises went on for maybe a minute, shuffling, a single step, then stillness again. And then, without warning, they moved away. The steps grew fainter until I couldn't hear them anymore. I stayed awake for hours after, gripping the knife, waiting for them to come back. At first light, I crawled out and checked around the tent. The grass was pressed flat in spots, forming faint footprints. They were too large for mine, and the tread pattern was different, deep, blocky shapes, the kind you'd see on heavy work boots. They circled the rocks and came within 10 feet of my tent. I told myself it could have been a farmer checking the land, even though I knew that made no sense. There were no farms that close, and nobody hikes the moors at midnight without a torch. Still, I decided to stay one more night. Stupid in hindsight, but I'd walked far to get there and didn't want to pack up so soon. The day was uneventful. I explored the valleys, took photos, and returned to camp before sunset. But as I boiled water for dinner, I saw movement again, on the same ridge as before. It was a man this time, close enough that I could make out his outline in the fading light. He was tall and thin, wearing a long dark coat that hung almost to his knees. I couldn't see his face because his head was tilted down, like he was looking at the ground. He wasn't walking, just standing, exactly like the night before. I stared for maybe 20 seconds and then he turned. He didn't walk along the ridge. He walked straight down it towards my direction. I grabbed my headlamp and shone it up at him, but the beam barely reached that far. I could still see him moving, though steady, unhurried steps. My stomach turned cold. I didn't wait to see if he'd reached the camp. I got inside my tent, zipped it shut, and sat there with my knife in one hand and my boots still on. Night fell quickly, and the air became damp and heavy. Around 9, I heard the first sound, grass parting under slow steps. This time, they didn't come from the rocks. They came from behind the tent. The steps circled once, then stopped. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I didn't dare move. The silence dragged on for what felt like forever. Then came a sound I'll never forget. The slow, deliberate drag of a fingertip down the side of my tent, from the top to the bottom. I wanted to yell, to make some noise to scare him off, but my voice caught in my throat. The finger traced another line on the opposite side. Then the steps started again, moving away. I waited, straining my ears, but after a minute there was nothing but the faint hiss of the wind. I didn't sleep at all. The moment the first pale light showed, I packed my things in a rush. My hands shook as I tore the tent down. When I turned to leave, I saw it on the rock where I'd sat that first night. A small, weathered coin, old, tarnished. It hadn't been there before. I left it where it was. The walk back to my car was long and silent. I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man following me through the mist. But there was nothing. The lane was empty when I reached it. I threw my gear in the car and drove without stopping until I reached the main road. I've been camping since then, but never alone, and never in the Peak District. Whatever I saw, or whoever it was, had no reason to be there, no reason to walk circles around a tent in the middle of the night. I still think about that coin, though, about how it sat there like it had been placed for me to find. I don't know what would have happened if I'd stayed another night, and I don't want to. It was late September of 2016 when I decided to spend a long weekend camping out in northern New Mexico. I'd been working in Albuquerque for the last year and had gotten used to short weekend hikes, but I wanted something that felt more like an escape. I picked a spot deep in the Carson National Forest, about 4 miles off any trail, far enough that I wouldn't run into day hikers or casual campers. I drove up early on Friday morning. The sky was sharp and blue in that way it gets before the air turns cold for good. The road turned to dirt about 30 minutes in, and then narrowed into a rutted track where I had to slow down to walking speed. I found a pull-off big enough for my truck and unloaded my pack. The forest here was a mix of tall pines and scrubby juniper, with rocky hillsides breaking up the tree cover. The hike in took a little over an hour. The ground was uneven, littered with broken rock and fallen branches, so every step made noise. I found a clearing on the south side of a slope, flat enough for a tent but sheltered from the wind. It was quiet, too quiet maybe. I didn't hear much bird activity even though the sun was still high. After setting up the tent, I gathered firewood and scouted the area. There were faint animal trails weaving through the brush, and I saw a few deer tracks pressed into the dirt. Nothing unusual. As the day went on, the light shifted from bright yellow to that pale gold you only get in early fall. That first night was calm. The wind sighed through the pines, and the temperature dropped hard after dark. I sat by the fire until the coals glowed deep red, then crawled into my sleeping bag. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote barked. The sound was faint and scattered, like it came from far down the valley. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of something moving outside my tent. It wasn't the light rustle of wind through grass. It was heavier, slow steps, dry leaves crackling. I lay still, holding my breath, my ears straining to separate sound from silence. The steps stopped after a few seconds. I told myself it was a deer or maybe an elk passing by, and eventually I fell back asleep. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of my camp. About 20 feet from my tent, in a patch of loose dirt, I found fresh tracks. They were barefoot, human-shaped prints. The toes and heel were clear, but the stride was wrong, too long, and the angles were odd, like the foot wasn't placed flat but twisted slightly with each step. I knelt down and touched one of them. The dirt was still slightly damp where the weight had pressed in. Couldn't have been more than a few hours old. I told myself it was probably some hiker passing through, but there were no boot prints or gear tracks, just those bare footprints, circling my camp once before heading back into the trees. The second day passed uneventfully. I hiked further up the ridge, collected more wood, and cooked a simple meal. But as the sun began to set, a feeling settled in my gut like a stone. The woods felt different, like the trees were holding their breath. Even the wind had died down. That night, I didn't light a big fire. I let the coals burn low and sat in the dark, listening. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't walking. It was pacing slow, deliberate steps moving left to right just outside the edge of my vision. When I turned my head, the sound would stop. Then it would start again on the other side. The footsteps weren't random. They had weight, a rhythm, almost like someone was studying my movements. I stayed awake most of the night, clutching the small hatchet I'd brought for splitting wood. My tent felt thin, like it wouldn't stop anything determined enough to get in. At some point before dawn, exhaustion pulled me under. When I stepped outside in the morning, the first thing I noticed was that the fire pit had been disturbed. The stones had been shifted, and the ashes were scattered, like someone had scraped through them. My gear bag was still zipped, but my water bottle lay about 10 feet away, half buried in pine needles. There were more prints, the same bare, twisted shape as before. I considered packing up right then, but I told myself I could handle one more night if I stayed alert. I'd worked outdoors enough to know fear can cloud judgment, and I didn't want to abandon the trip over nothing more than strange noises. That day, I barely left camp. I kept my knife on me at all times. The silence had deepened.
No squirrels.
No bird calls. Not even the distant cry of a coyote. The forest felt drained, as if every living thing had moved on without me. When darkness came, I didn't start a fire at all. I wanted to see without the glare of flames in my eyes. The moon was thin and pale, barely enough to make out shapes. I sat against a tree with my pack beside me and waited. It didn't take long. The first sound was a snapping branch, maybe 30 feet away. Then came the steps, slow, dragging, almost shuffling. They stopped, and in the faint moonlight, I saw a shape just beyond the tree-line. Tall, still, not moving like an animal. The outline was wrong, the shoulders too narrow, the limbs too long. It stood there for what felt like minutes, though my chest told me it was seconds. Then it moved, not away, but sideways, circling me again. I gripped the hatchet so hard my hand ached. My breathing sounded loud in my ears. At one point, I swear I saw it crouch, its outline bending low before disappearing behind a fallen log. I didn't move, couldn't. The steps came closer, then stopped again. I heard a sound then, not speech but something like it. A low, broken murmur, the kind you might hear from someone talking in their sleep. My scalp prickled. The hair on my arms lifted. Something in me broke then. I stuffed my knife into my belt, grabbed my pack, and started moving. I didn't run, not at first. I walked fast, eyes darting from shadow to shadow, every muscle screaming to keep going. The shape followed. I could hear it in the brush, staying just far enough back that I couldn't get a clear look. When I finally broke into a run, the sound in the trees kept pace with me. I didn't stop until I saw the dull shine of my truck through the trees. My legs burned, and my lungs felt like they were tearing open. I threw my gear into the bed without caring what broke and climbed into the cab. When I turned the key, the headlights lit up the tree-line. For just a second, I saw it, standing there between two pines, bare feet in the dirt, head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its face caught the light in a way that made no sense, as if it didn't belong to the shape it was attached to. I didn't wait to see more. I slammed the truck into gear and bounced down the rutted track until I hit pavement. I drove the rest of the night without stopping, checking the mirrors every few seconds like a reflex I couldn't turn off. I never went back to that part of the forest. I don't even drive that route anymore. People always ask why I cut my trip short, but I just tell them I had a bad feeling. I've learned that explaining what I saw only makes me sound like I'm trying to convince myself it was real. But I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't supposed to be there. It was late October of 2014 when I decided to head out into the north woods of Montana for a 3-day solo hunting trip. I'd been out there before, but never alone for more than a single night. The deer were starting to move lower with the cold creeping in, and I figured it was my best chance before the snow got too deep. I drove out early in the morning, the sun barely over the hills, the frost on the grass still thick and white. The air felt sharp, the kind that cuts into your lungs and makes you cough a little. My truck rattled over the dirt road, each bump shaking my gear in the back. I'd packed a small tent, sleeping bag, a compact stove, extra food, and my .308 rifle. By noon, I'd parked at a small pull-off along a logging road that wasn't maintained anymore. From there, I had to hike in about 3 miles to the spot I'd marked on my map. It was quiet, the only sounds being my boots on frozen leaves and the occasional knock of a branch against my pack. The deeper I went, the more I noticed how heavy the silence was. Not total silence. I could still hear the faint rush of a creek somewhere downhill, but it was that kind of quiet where every little noise seemed sharper. I reached my spot around 2 in the afternoon. It was a small clearing surrounded by lodgepole pines, with a ridge about 100 yards to the east that gave me a good view of a small valley. I set my tent up with my back toward the ridge so the wind wouldn't cut through it at night. Once camp was set, I walked the area for a while, looking for fresh tracks. The ground was hard from the frost, but I found a few hoof prints and what looked like fresh droppings near a stand of aspen trees. That first evening, I climbed up the ridge with my rifle and sat, watching the valley as the light faded. The sky turned that deep purple blue you only get in the mountains, the moon already bright. I didn't see any deer that night, but I stayed up there until I could barely see my own hands before heading back down. That night, the cold bit hard. Even inside the tent, wrapped in my bag, I could feel the chill creeping in. I woke up several times, listening to the wind rush through the trees. At one point, I thought I heard something walking through the leaves near camp. Just slow, deliberate crunches. I froze, holding my breath, trying to tell if it was an animal or just branches falling. After maybe 30 seconds, it stopped. I told myself it was probably a deer moving through and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, frost covered everything. My boots were stiff, my water bottle had a thin layer of ice on top. I made coffee over the little stove, the steam curling in the cold air, and then headed out to hunt. I followed the ridge for a while, moving slow and quiet, scanning for movement. Around mid-morning, I found fresh tracks again, this time deeper and more defined, heading downhill toward the creek. I followed them for a while, but they eventually disappeared into thicker brush. I stood there for a bit, trying to decide whether to push through or circle around. That's when I heard it. A sharp snap of a stick somewhere off to my left, maybe 50 yards away. It wasn't a light sound. It was the kind of break you hear when something big steps down. I stayed still, scanning the trees, but nothing moved. After a minute or so, I kept walking, but slower. The day stayed uneventful. No deer, no real sign of anything besides that snap earlier. I headed back to camp by late afternoon, the cold setting in again as the sun dropped. I cooked a small meal, sat by the dim orange glow of my lantern, and tried to read a few pages from a book I'd brought, but the words kept blurring from the fatigue. That night, things got different. Sometime deep into the night, I woke up again, this time to a faint sound that didn't fit with the normal forest noises. It was like a dragging sound, slow, uneven, somewhere just outside my tent. My heart started to thud in my chest. I stayed still, listening. The dragging stopped, and for a few seconds there was nothing. Then soft crunches like careful footsteps. They circled halfway around the tent. Slow, deliberate. I could hear the weight in them. My rifle was leaning against my pack near the tent entrance, and every instinct told me to grab it, but I didn't want to make a sound. The steps stopped again, maybe 5 feet from me, on the opposite side of the tent. I waited. The cold air inside the tent felt even sharper, my breath loud in my ears. After maybe a minute, the steps moved away, fading into the trees. I stayed awake for hours after that, listening for them to come back. They didn't. The next morning, I stepped outside and saw something that made my stomach drop. Around my tent, the frost was disturbed in long, scuffed marks, like something had been dragged through it. There were boot prints, not mine. They were larger, wider, and the stride was strange. Too long in some places, too close in others. They came in from the trees, circled my tent, then disappeared back the way they came. I didn't hunt that day. I stayed near camp, keeping my rifle close, listening for any sound. Around mid-afternoon, I decided to cut the trip short. The unease was too much, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there watching me. I packed slowly, keeping my head on a swivel. The forest felt different now. Not quiet in the peaceful way, but quiet like it was holding its breath. The hike back to the truck felt longer than it had on the way in. Every time I glanced back, the trail behind me seemed darker. When I finally reached the truck, I threw my gear in the back, started the engine, and didn't stop until I hit the highway. I never found out who it was, or why they were out there in the middle of nowhere, creeping around my tent at night. but I've never gone hunting alone since. Even now, years later, when I think about that slow drag through the frost and those deliberate footsteps circling in the dark, I feel that same tightness in my chest. It wasn't an animal, and that's the part that keeps me awake sometimes. I was 22 when I decided to spend a weekend camping alone on an old farm in rural Nebraska. It was mid-October 2017. A friend of mine had inherited the property from his late uncle but hadn't gotten around to selling it yet. He told me it was about 50 acres, mostly flat fields with a few patches of trees, a broken-down barn, and an old farmhouse that hadn't been lived in for over a decade. He gave me permission to camp anywhere I wanted as long as I didn't go inside the house. It wasn't safe. The plan was simple. Park my truck at the far edge of the property, hike into the open field with my gear, and set up my tent near a small grove of trees about a quarter mile from the barn. I liked the idea of being surrounded by quiet, just wind, grass, and sky. No neighbors, no passing cars. When I arrived late in the afternoon, the weather was cool but calm. The sky had that pale, washed-out color it gets in fall, and the air smelled faintly of dry earth and cut hay. My boots crunched over old stalks as I walked to the spot I'd picked out. The grass there was knee-high and brittle, making a soft rustling sound as I moved. I pitched my tent facing the trees with my small fire pit a few feet in front. By the time I was done setting everything up, the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows across the field. The barn in the distance looked darker than it should have, its roof sagging and one of the doors hanging crooked on its hinges. I got the fire going, cooked a simple meal, and sat on my folding chair while the light drained from the sky. Out here, without city lights, darkness feels different, thicker, almost like it has weight. The grove behind me creaked faintly in the wind, and every so often I'd hear the dry snap of a branch falling somewhere inside. Around 9 p.m., the temperature dropped sharply. I pulled on a heavier jacket and sat closer to the fire. That's when I noticed something strange. There was a faint rhythmic sound, far off but steady. At first I thought it was just the wind dragging something across the barn's metal siding, but it didn't quite match. It was more like the sound of something tapping wood, slow and deliberate. 3 or 4 beats, a pause, then again. Carried on for at least 20 minutes. I kept glancing toward the barn, but from this distance I couldn't see much. I told myself it was just some loose board moving in the breeze. Still, the sound put me on edge. Eventually it stopped, and I tried to focus on the fire until I felt tired enough to call it a night. Inside the tent, the thin nylon walls did little to block the sounds of the field. I could hear the grass shifting, the occasional squeak of a field mouse, and once or twice, a louder crunch, like something heavier moving through. I didn't have any food inside with me, so I wasn't worried about animals. But the wind had died down completely, which made every little noise seem sharper. I must have dozed off because the next time I opened my eyes, it was to total silence. The kind of silence where your own breathing feels too loud. I lay there, staring into the darkness, unsure of what woke me. Then I heard it again, that slow, deliberate tapping. Only now it wasn't coming from the barn. It was closer. It sounded like it was coming from the grove of trees just behind my tent. 3 taps, pause. 3 taps, pause. I froze. I told myself it could be a branch swaying and hitting another tree, but the wind hadn't picked up at all. My heartbeat was so loud I could feel it in my throat. I stayed completely still, listening. After a few minutes, the tapping stopped. I almost convinced myself it was nothing, but then I heard the crunch of grass. Slow steps, not an animal scurrying, something bigger, each footfall spaced evenly apart. It circled halfway around the tent, the sound of the steps fading, then returning on the other side. My mouth had gone dry. I reached slowly toward my pack, where I'd stashed my flashlight, and when I clicked it on, the beam hit the side of the tent in a pale circle. I didn't unzip it right away. Part of me didn't want to know. But after sitting there for nearly 10 minutes, flashlight in hand, I told myself I'd regret not checking. When I unzipped the flap and shined the light out, all I saw at first was tall grass swaying slightly. My breath hung in the cold air. I swept the beam left, right, toward the trees. Nothing. Then I aimed it lower, at the ground, and noticed something. Flattened patches in the grass, like someone had been walking there. I stepped out slowly, my boots making that same crunch I'd been hearing. I followed the flattened trail a few feet before I stopped. It led straight into the grove. The trees were a dark wall ahead of me, and the beam from my flashlight barely penetrated more than a few feet in. That's when I heard a sound from inside the grove. Not tapping this time. Breathing. Slow, steady breathing, like someone trying not to move too much. My chest tightened, and every instinct told me to get back to the tent, grab my stuff, and leave. I backed away carefully, never turning my light from the trees, and when I reached the tent, I shoved my gear into my pack as fast as I could. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped the flashlight. Once everything was in the truck bed, I climbed in, started the engine, and swung the headlights toward the grove. For a split second, I thought I saw movement, a figure stepping back deeper between the trunks. But it was gone before I could be sure. I drove out of there fast, my tires kicking up dirt from the narrow farm road. In the mirror, the grove and the barn shrank into the dark until they disappeared completely. When I got home that night, I dumped my pack on the floor and sat in the kitchen for a long time without moving. I told myself maybe it had been a hunter passing through, or some local checking the property. But the thing that still bothers me is how quiet they were, how deliberate the steps sounded, how they circled the tent without saying anything, without making their presence known. The next day, I called my friend and told him I wouldn't be camping out there again. He didn't ask why, and I didn't tell him, but I still think about it sometimes. How, in all that open land, someone chose to stand just a few feet away from me in the dark, doing nothing but listening. It was the summer of 2013, and I had taken a few days off work to get away from the noise of the city. I wanted to be completely alone, somewhere quiet, somewhere far from the hum of traffic and the endless chatter of people. I was 27 then, with enough camping experience to feel confident heading out into the woods alone. I had chosen a remote part of northern Minnesota, near the Canadian border, because I had read that the fishing was good and the hiking trails barely saw any visitors. I drove for hours until the paved roads turned to gravel, then to dirt. My cell service had dropped miles ago, and I didn't mind. That was part of the plan. By the time I reached the spot I had marked on my printed map, the sun was low in the sky. It was a narrow clearing just off a trail that looked like it hadn't been walked in months. I parked my old truck on a flat spot and began unloading my gear. The air smelled of pine sap and damp earth, and every movement I made seemed to echo in the stillness. I pitched my tent a short distance from the truck, near a small slope that led down to a stream. The ground was soft with layers of pine needles, and the occasional distant call of a bird was the only sound. I boiled water for a quick meal, ate while leaning back on my pack, and let the quiet sink in. By the time I finished cleaning up, the light had faded into that dim blue haze just before full darkness. That first night passed without anything unusual. I woke early, brewed coffee over my small stove, and spent the day exploring along the stream and collecting firewood. The weather was mild, though I noticed that the wind had died completely in the afternoon. The forest around me felt unnervingly still, as if holding its breath. When evening came, I lit a small fire and cooked trout I had caught in the stream. The smoke curled straight up into the still air before disappearing among the branches above. It was just after the last trace of daylight had drained from the sky that I noticed it. A faint crunching sound from somewhere behind my tent, up the slope. I froze, holding my fork halfway to my mouth, and listened. At first I thought it was just a branch falling, but then it came again, slow, steady, deliberate steps on dry ground. I leaned forward, peering into the darkness, but saw nothing. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the sound didn't move off. It stayed in the same spot for what felt like a minute, then stopped entirely. The forest returned to its deep silence, broken only by the occasional pop from my fire. I stayed still for a long time, my ears straining for any more noise. When nothing came, I forced myself to relax and finish my meal. Still, I kept glancing into the shadows beyond the glow of the fire. That night, I lay in my tent listening to the faint gurgle of the stream. I was almost asleep when I heard it again. Not up the slope this time, but to my left, somewhere in the trees. A crunch, then another, then the sound of something brushing against branches. It was moving slowly, almost circling. My heart thudded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I stayed completely still, staring at the faint outline of the tent ceiling. The sound stopped after a while, replaced by a long stretch of silence. I don't know how long I lay there awake, but eventually I must have drifted off. When I woke in the morning, there was no sign of anything. I walked around the campsite, scanning the ground, but if there had been tracks, they were lost in the thick layer of needles and leaves. The second day passed quietly. I hiked farther along the stream, collected more wood, and kept telling myself it was just an animal the night before. By evening, I had almost convinced myself, but as I sat by the fire after dark, I felt it again. That prickling on the back of my neck, the sense of eyes on me. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees with my headlamp. It was sometime after midnight when I woke abruptly in the tent. No sound had woken me, but I was instantly alert, my whole body tense. Then I heard it, slow, heavy steps in the dead leaves, coming from the same slope where I had first heard them. They weren't quick or light like a deer's. They were measured, almost cautious, with long pauses between each one. I held my breath, staring toward the faint light of the tent's mesh door. The steps grew closer, then stopped. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Then came the sound of something brushing against the side of the tent. Not a sharp scratch, but a slow drag, like fingers or maybe a stick being pulled along the fabric. Every instinct screamed at me to grab my knife and flashlight, but I didn't move. I lay there, barely breathing, listening as whatever it was lingered on the other side of that thin nylon wall. Then, as quietly as it had come, it moved away. I heard the steps fade into the trees, slow and steady until they were gone. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping my knife, my eyes burning from not blinking enough. When morning finally came, I stepped outside to find nothing disturbed. No tracks, no signs of any animal. My tent, my gear, the fire pit. Everything looked exactly as I had left it. That almost unsettled me more than if I had found something. I decided to cut my trip short. I packed quickly, shoving gear into the truck bed without my usual neatness. The sun was barely over the horizon when I got behind the wheel. As I pulled away, I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the clearing. The dirt road felt longer on the way out. Every bend in the trail made me tense, and more than once I thought I caught movement among the trees, though it was probably just shadows. When I finally reached the highway, I pulled over and sat in the truck for a while, letting the tension drain out of me. It was only then that I realized how dry my mouth was and how tight my chest felt. I never went back to that part of the forest. Even now, years later, I still think about those slow, deliberate steps in the dark, and how they seemed to follow the edge of my firelight. just far enough that I could never see who or what was there. It wasn't a ghost story. It wasn't anything supernatural, but it was real and it was close. Too close. And that's the part that still keeps me awake sometimes.